Hello, I am Leslie Van Zandt, Chief Advancement Officer at WAMU. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Diane Rehm Book Club. Today, Diane will host Pulitzer Prize-winning author Jhumpa Lahiri. They will discuss her 2023 collection of short stories entitled Roman Stories, which was just released in paperback. The collection is made up of 9 short stories, first written in Italian, then translated to English. Questions about identity, foreignness, and definitions of home weave the stories together. These are themes that might sound familiar to fans of Lahiri's past work, such as Interpreter of the Maladies, The Namesake, and my favorite, The Lowland. Before today's conversation starts, a few reminders. If you'd like to ask a question, please do so using the Q&A function found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you'd like to access closed captioning, please click on the CC button, which is also found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Like everything we do at WAMU, this book club would not be possible without your support. If you enjoyed the discussion today, please consider making a gift online by visiting dianerehm.org/give. And now, here's Diane.
Thank you, Leslie. And Jhumpa Lahiri, welcome. I'm so glad to see you again.
Likewise, it's wonderful to see you again.
Thank you. Let's start with the title, Roman Stories. I gather it's something of an homage. Jhumpa. Oh dear. Jhumpa.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I didn't hear the question.
It's something of an homage.
Yes, the title. Yes, it is an homage to the Italian writer Alberto Moravia, who wrote novels, short stories, and many other things, essays. And he was one of the first writers, really the first fiction writer I was able to read and really engage with in Italian. I had read him in translation many years ago when I didn't know how to read in Italian. And then I went back to him when I began my journey of reading and eventually writing in Italian. And I was so struck by his enormous cycle of stories set in Rome called Racconti Romani. And these were stories set in post-war Italy during the economic boom, and against that socioeconomic backdrop, look at characters in Rome who are really living in the margins and on the edge, and often hand to mouth and in very precarious circumstances. And so my use of this title that I borrow from Moravia is, on the one hand, to thank him for all that he showed me and taught me, not only about Italy in those years, but also about the Italian language, because he has a remarkably clear Italian that was very important for me to encounter when I did. But also to look at, a way of reading Rome through its citizens who live in the quiet corners and are struggling and are not in the sun-filled piazza, not at the center of things.
And it's a new version of Rome through your eyes, and I gather originally in Italian, and then you did part of the translation of this book into English. Why did you decide to do it that way? And how is the new Rome so different from his?
Well, I'll answer the second part first. I mean, I think the new Rome is different in that, look, society is always a complicated thing. Cities are complicated entities. Rome is a very complicated city from its origins to the present day. But what we see in today's Rome in 2024 is new immigration to Rome, new populations, new faces, new languages, new traditions, new cultures, new energy, both positive and problematic. I mean, all of the things that unfortunately tend to arise when a society welcomes or, on the other hand, tolerates the presence of others, of foreigners. I moved to Rome in 2012, so 12 years ago, and it struck me right away that there was a big divide between people who were considered Italian and people who seemed to be lumped into the category of the straniero, the other, the foreigner, the person who didn't belong. And so, of course, this struck me and interested me for the obvious reasons, given that I grew up that way in analogous circumstances in the United States, and I too found myself new to the city and was very curious to see how or even whether the question of integration was possible, how the second generation Romans were faring, how their parents were coping with the challenges of raising children in Rome, in a culture very different from their place or places of origin. All of this interested me as a person and as a writer, and influenced the writing of this cycle of stories. What I saw, unfortunately, was a great deal of hostility, of fear, of xenophobia, of racism, and of violence. Now, Moravia's stories also have an element of violence to them. So in that sense, they are, they share that as well. They share that violent dimension, if you will. But it's not racially motivated violence, which is what I would read about in the newspapers, with shock and with dismay and with anger. But what I noticed was that people didn't really, even though there might be an article in a newspaper for a couple of days about this episode or this incident, things tended to sort of get swept under the rug. And the question of whether or not these issues were really important was puzzling to me, that why these issues were not getting more attention. And so that's how Rome, in my opinion, one of the ways what Rome has changed. Of course, in Moravia's time, Rome was just emerging from a World War II, from devastation, from poverty, from all sorts of things. The economic boom was, representative of a flourishing, of a city devastated by war and all of its repercussions. So there were other factors, clearly, that are not, the case now, but it's a moment of transition for this city,
Indeed.
deep transition. So that's how Rome has changed. As for why I translated the stories, most of them, I translated 6 of the 9 stories in the end, and I asked Todd Portnowitz, a wonderful editor and translator at Knopf, to translate a couple as well. One reason was that, it's very hard for me to translate something I've just written. It feels, it's already a destabilizing process, even if it's something that I've written 10 years ago, but it's particularly difficult to translate something freshly sort of executed. And there are a couple of stories I just couldn't reasonably go back into and to convert into a rework in English in time for sort of the publication schedule, shall we say, for the book, what the editors had in mind. They said, okay, we want the manuscript by such and such a date. And I sort of thought to myself, I don't think I can do this. But the other reason is that, I felt, I was curious. With each of these Italian books, I've tried something slightly different. The first book I gave entirely to Anne Goldstein, who translated the very first book I wrote in Italian. The second book, I translated. It was entirely a self-translation, Whereabouts. And then in this case, maybe also because they were stories, I felt that it would be an interesting experiment to have some of them translated by somebody else. Also, because in that sense, he was a very good, he gave a very good eye on my own translations, and it was also interesting for me to see how he was translating me. And because of that dialogue, I just found it quite illuminating.
Wonderful. I have been to Rome several times. I know the steps that become one of the major stories in your book. And I wonder if you would read to us a portion of that segment, the steps.
With pleasure. So this story is it's actually a 6-part story.
Yes.
So this is the first of the parts, and it's called The Mother, but where I'll start reading is not exactly the beginning of her section, but I'll read it to the end. The mother lives in a rather small apartment with her husband and several other men from their country, who all work late hours and come home bone tired. They make deliveries on their bikes or scooters, or they peel and chop kilos of vegetables, or fry slices of eggplant in restaurant kitchens. It's her job when she gets home to put on the rice and red lentils and make goat stew with potatoes for the group, to set the table for 7 and then clean up and do the dishes. The father of the 2 children comes home in the evening. His wife is abroad at the moment. The mother lets him look over the grocery receipts and shows him the chicken, potatoes, and vegetables on the stove, everything still warm. She unties her apron and walks back to the steps that lead to the avenue where she'll catch the bus that takes her home. The steps are no longer her own. Before she heads down, she sees 2 girls wearing heavy makeup, black clothes, and chunky-heeled boots posing for photographs. Other people are sitting here and there, seemingly with nothing to do, waiting to enjoy the sunset. If there happens to be a film crew working in the middle of the staircase with their cables and lights and dolly and clapboard, she has to stop and wait without speaking until they give the all clear. One time she saw a famous actor, a short, funny man who was pretending to fight with another guy in front of the camera. The mother gazes once more at the sky, and in some way she feels closer to her son. She thinks, wherever one goes, The elements of the firmament, moon, sun, stars, wind, and rain never change. Her son, as distant as he is, sees them too. Oddly, even though it's more arduous, she prefers climbing the steps than going down them. She's wary of the descent. She worries about losing her balance. She notices a group of boys about her son's age all staring into the same cell phone. They've abandoned their heavy black backpacks on the steps, and they're singing a song huddled together. She feels dizzy. She sits for a moment, setting down her plastic shopping bag. Years ago on Sundays, before she started working for the family, when the city emptied out, at the time of year when there seemed to be more cicadas than people, when the thrumming of those insects made it seem as if the whole world and even the air were trembling, she and her husband would eat lunch on the steps around noon. They'd eat with their fingers the way they'd learned, paying no attention to the passersby who might be looking at them askance. They were still a young couple, and she thought that sooner or later their son would join them. Back then, she'd hoped they'd have another child. She stands up and proceeds on her way. There's another couple on the steps. Tourists, lost, flushed from the heat, but elegant. The wife wears a long striped cotton sundress and a black straw hat. The husband wears a shirt with short sleeves, purple with white checks. He holds a salmon-colored map of the city in his hands. He asks, "Where's the park?" "Up that way," the mother replies, pointing to the summit. The mother goes down a few steps, hesitant, and feels her head spin again. The husband with the map notices her faltering and extends an arm politely, instantly, to lend support. The husband and wife accompany the mother, who, with a mix of gratitude and embarrassment, spontaneously accepts the help of this total stranger and the surprisingly cool sensation of his skin under her hand, all the way to the bottom of the steps, where the cars are parked on a slant. For a few seconds, she watches the couple climb happily up the steps toward the park before walking down toward the tram line and the buses. She feels the presence of someone who's running behind her, who shouts out, grabbing onto the fabric of her skirt. "Hey, Signora!" She turns and sees one of the boys in the group that was listening to music. He's holding her plastic shopping bag in his hands. His forehead is covered in pimples. He says, "This is your stuff." Then he rushes back to his friends sitting on the steps. The mother thinks that the steps in this city, though made of stone, are something like the sea, where everything washes back eventually. When she opens the shopping bag, the acrid smell of the meat she'll cook tonight rises to her nostrils.
Tell me why that story, as well as the other 5 that are within that chapter called The Steps, how do they represent Rome as a whole? What do you feel when you think about those steps? When I was there, which I confess was many years ago, there was no trash. There were no thrown bottles. There was an immaculate sidewalk leading up to those stairs. As you describe it with those various groups, it feels different. And I wonder if those steps represent to you a difference in Rome as a whole.
I think so. I mean, I actually live next to the steps I describe in this story. And so the observations are, my own observations gave me the raw material to build the sequence of the 6 different people who walk up and down the 126 steps throughout the course of a day. And I think that, certainly to me, it represents a microcosm of the city in that, what I see in Rome are these distinct groups, if you will. I mean, there are those who don't question their identity as Romans. It's their city, they're born there, or they've chosen to come there from other parts of Italy usually, and they feel that they sort of, are tied to the city in an unquestioned way. There are tourists who crop up even in this small segment, often lost, often looking for the park or this thing or that thing, with maps in their hands, or now they don't even have maps, they have their phones. There's a mix of ages, there's a mix of young people, old people. There are expats who have sort of chosen Rome as a place to be, but have maintained very, I think, distinct and coherent ties to their place of origin. And then there are the people like the mother in this story who come here under difficult circumstances to work kind of the most important jobs in the society. In her case, she's taking care of 2 children of very, very busy parents. Many of them are taking care of the elderly. And they are the ones who are, the most vulnerable, and their stories are the ones that are the least heard. And so,
of course, she has left her own 13-year-old son with grandparents, so that part of her is constantly thinking about her son, and she notices that the stars and the moon, they share, but they're not together. So she is in a difficult spot. Many of your non-native characters experience racism. Was that what you saw in Italy?
Well, I mean, I'll just begin by saying, sadly, that racism is a problem everywhere. Everywhere I've lived, everywhere I've known about, heard about, in some form or another. And so, it's certainly not a problem that's specific to Italy, but it is a problem in Italy, and it's a problem. It's more of a problem because of what I was saying earlier, because the society is changing, has changed, is better, more accurate to say, has changed in the past 20-25 years. And that's why we see the hostility, the fear, the xenophobia, the racism, and the racially motivated violence at times toward people who are deemed outsiders, and in some broad definition, threats or problematic to the society. And so that's what I have stopped to explore in several of the stories in this book, and sometimes the violence is quite literal.
Indeed, in the delivery.
Yes.
A young woman of color is walking along, and pellets are shot at her, and a young man says, "Why don't you go wash your dirty legs?" That was really shocking to me.
Yeah.
And I mean, I can see that happening more in the United States now. And it's hard for me to realize it's happening in Italy even now and in Rome.
Well, I mean, Rome is, Rome is a big city with lots of components and rings, and and I think that if you start to live a pretty ordinary life, if you start to take the bus and you start to go to sort of some of the outer neighborhoods for whatever reason, if you're outside of that sort of historic center bubble where everything is more, shall we say, catered toward the experience of mass tourism, you see attitudes, you see looks and things, and I myself, living here, really it depends on the context. Depends on the context of where I am and who I'm with, and sort of whether I'm taking public transportation or not, and I have to sort of prepare myself for all kinds of reactions or stares, or I mean, some of the kindest people I've ever met are Romans, and not only my friends, but just people in my neighborhood, people at my pharmacy, people at my gym, people at people I see every day and interact with every day. They're truly some of the kindest, warmest, most affectionate people I've ever met in my life. And I feel enormous gratitude to have discovered this city, well, for many reasons, but that is certainly one of them. And then there are other times when I realize, they're not, they're seeing me, they're seeing my face, they're seeing my skin color, and they're making associations to, that are that are not friendly, that are not affectionate by any stretch. That means by any stretch. And so I think a combination of that lived experience, and also things I witnessed, things I read about in the papers, things I followed, and sometimes they made it to like a TV news segment for a couple of days. These things combined to in the conception of these stories. But I think it's important, though, to say, to make clear that I mean, what the book is really, the stories are really about, is another one of Moravia's great themes, which is the theme of alienation across race, color, culture, nationality, background, whatever, however we want to divide people. Alienation is a universal human condition. For some people it's acute, for some people it's less acute, for some people it's intermittent, for some people it's more of an ongoing feeling. But I think alienation is something that no sentient person can ever escape.
Exactly. And I must say, I came away from reading these beautiful stories with a sense of loneliness for each of the characters. And before we go further, I want to invite the more than 300 viewers, listeners to this conversation to submit their questions in the chat box, and we'll be happy to take them. Before the program began, we had several questions submitted. So I want to read the first to you from Anonymous, saying, interpreter of Maladies really helped shape the adult reader I am today. how would you say you and your writing are the same or different today through the lens of Roman stories, or even more broadly?
I think my writing is both the same and has gone through a transformation, gone through a metamorphosis, if you will, linguistically, and in some sense stylistically, though that's shifting situation. But certainly the beginnings of my writing in Italian, there was both the new language and therefore the element of translation for the English language reader, and more, shall we say, much more pared back style, because I had more limited resources as a writer in Italian when I was beginning.
If we can, good. You have homes both in New York and in Italy. Why did you decide to move to Rome, and how long are you there throughout the year?
Well, I decided to move here. I wanted to move here because, well, the obvious reason is that I had been studying, I diligently been studying the Italian language, not really knowing why, not really needing to, but I was, and it felt like it was a kind of a calling, and I was pursuing this calling on my own largely, and I made some decent progress. I got to the stage where I was, could function in the language, shall we say, have basic conversations. But I knew that if I didn't really spend a significant amount of time somewhere in Italy, at least a year, that I would never really get to the other side where I wanted to be with the language. And again, I didn't know why I wanted to acquire the Italian language. I just knew that I did. And so the reason I first moved here with my family was for that, was linguistically driven. I think that also, more broadly, our children were small, and I had the idea that, my husband and I were both raised in very international contexts. I was raised in the United States, but I was, visiting India with my family very regularly throughout my childhood. And with it, never, feeling fully American, and aware that the home I was being raised in was not truly home for my parents. My husband also was raised for different reasons. He was raised in different countries around the world because of his father's work. And so though we were raising our children in Brooklyn, New York, a wonderfully international part of the world, we still felt that it was important to expose them to life somewhere else, to a reality that was different, and that was difficult to that they couldn't take for granted, where they would feel
not to India.
Not to India, and not to Guatemala, where my husband was raised. No, because at that point there was also the language question. There was the drive of, I really wanted to learn Italian well enough to speak it comfortably and confidently.
Why do you think that issue of learning Italian was so important to you when you had been raised in a home with Indian parents?
Well, I mean, this is a complex question, but I'll try to be brief. I mean, I think that part of it was that I was raised well, I was raised bilingually. I was raised with Bengali and with English, which I learned as a child. And what I now realize is that both of those languages was, in some sense, a foreign language to me, and I felt like an outsider in both of those languages for that reason. And I think that the conflict that characterized the daily conflict that characterized my entire upbringing boiled down to sort of how I was negotiating life in these two languages, and both were somehow languages I, like most of us, we had to learn, we were expected to learn, we needed to learn to sort of survive in the world or at home or with our parents or at school, or whatever. And maybe because I went on to become a writer, maybe because language has always meant so much to me. Words have meant so much to me. I needed a third language to well, not to call my own, because I don't think of any language really as my own. I don't think of Italian as my own. I don't think of Bengali as my own. I don't think of English as my own. I think I feel like an outsider in each of these languages, in all of the languages I know, really. I don't have a full identification with anything close to sort of what one calls a mother tongue.
And speaking of mother tongues, we have a question from Karen. Please discuss the theme of parenthood, specifically loss, that shows up in a number of your stories.
So the question of parenthood and specifically of loss, is that what you said? Loss, yeah. Well, I mean, parents, it's interesting. I just reread last night. I just reread Fathers and Sons by Turgenev. What an amazing novel that is, very much about loss, the loss of children, and what parents experience. On the one hand, you produce life and you gain these incredible creatures that you take care of and love, and they love you, and you learn everything all over again thanks to them, and you learn so much about yourself and about them, ideally, but our job is to set them free. As we know, our job is to let them go and to survive without us. I mean, and that's, I can say it like this, but inside it's such a hard thing to do. And I think that once one becomes a parent and gets to a certain stage, when one's children are older and independent, then everything it all comes full circle, and you realize you did this as well, with your parents, and then everything that you went through and thought is revised. And, so anyway, this collection in some ways some of the stories mark sort of how I am also moving through time as a parent. Some of the characters are clearly younger than I am, and have younger children, and have different relationships to, well, I mean, one of the things I think that crops up in these stories, and something certainly I felt acutely as a child, and I still see it in my foreign friends, and I have many, many foreign friends everywhere in the world, in the United States, mostly in the United States, is this question of what happens when you raise children in a country that you don't feel comfortable in, that you don't call home, in which you speak the language with an accent or whatever, what have you. These were the things that clearly, I mean, my parents were always aware of the fact that they were raising me in a strange country with strange ways, strange everything. And they were just waiting and seeing what would happen to me in this strange atmosphere called the United States of America. And, you know, I sounded American, but I didn't look American, at least back in the definition of the 1970s. Um, and but I see that very much so, the anxiety of parents who, you know, I think one of the things that is most alienating for not all, but for many human beings, is the idea that your children are aliens, that your children do not resemble you or do not share your cultural references and so on and so forth. And I see for that reason that many people actually do decide to either move their kids back to their country of origin so they can be more fluent in the culture or in the language, because they don't want to see their children transform into other beings dominated by other strains, shall we say, right? And because that's a form of loss, to go back to the question, it's a big form of loss.
The other element that I'm sure was deliberate, but I wonder why, was the lack of names, rather just initials. So was that meant as part of that alienation, or was there something else in your mind when you decided not to name the characters in your short stories?
It's certainly a deliberate choice on my part.
Yes.
I did not name them. I gave initials throughout. Part of the thinking here is that, I mean, what is a name? A name is a pipeline to identity. It's a pipeline to people pinpointing where you are from, or where you are, you know, where you're really from. I mean, okay, so me with my name, right? If someone looked at me when I was in school and I had a name tag, and they would say, where are you from? Or even in college, or even tomorrow, if I go to some event, you know, typically the question will be, you know, where are you from? And I might say, well, I grew up in Rhode Island, because I don't feel like I'm from Rhode Island, because I was raised to feel that I wasn't from Rhode Island, but that we were living there. But that was different from being from the place.
Exactly.
And then there's the second question, but where are you really from? What is Lahiri? What kind of name is that? And so this, to step away from that, from that in a fictional place where we don't actually need the names to enter into the souls of the characters.
And in the same way, this from Deborah, who says, I thought it was interesting that the home countries of so many of the characters were not specified. It made the experiences so universal. Can you discuss your decision to do this? It goes along with that use of the initial.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a more abstract key, if you will, a more abstract but also more inclusive way of thinking about otherness and foreignness. Because, I mean, one thing I always felt growing up in the United States was, you know, and I certainly saw this, you know, perhaps conditioned by my parents, they tended to trust people who For example, they tended to trust people who spoke English with foreign accents over people who didn't, because they knew, okay, even if they're not coming from India or from our part of India or whatever, these are also people who have very complicated lives, who have left loved ones behind, who miss this, that, and the other thing, who have traveled, who have come here for whatever reason, who have, who are here thanks to documents and visas and all of those things that were always on my parents' minds. And to be honest, was just simply not on the minds of many of the people I knew growing up. Not all, but many had never even stopped to think about those things. Most of the people I grew up with when I was a young girl, they didn't they didn't know what it was like to be on an airplane. They didn't travel. There wasn't that kind of, the world was different back then. It's not like today, everyone's always everywhere flying on planes. Maybe not in the past few days, but certainly the world has changed quite a bit in the past 40 years. But so this was, a way of connecting, even in an abstract way, with other foreigners. Because in some sense, I do think all foreigners speak a common language. And that common language is the language of survival. And survival is a big word. And some foreigners are truly on the edge of survival, literal survival. And others are surviving in a, trying to survive in a more, so shall we say, in emotional ways, which are also important. We know that everything matters. Our mental health matters, our financial circumstances matter, our immigration status matters. Like, there are so many pieces, right, to human beings. And when they're foreigners, when they're transplants, there are even more of them, more pieces to consider. And so I think that I wanted in this collection to focus the attention on the interiority of the characters and not sort of burden them with with specific markers, not put a pin on them and say, oh, this person, because I guess this is the thing. I guess my whole thinking about this is really to get to propose a new way of thinking about what being Italian is. Because if we think that a character named Giulia is automatically Italian and a character named Jhumpa isn't, then we're already going backward in some sense, because we're using these associations, names, where you're from, where you're really from, to insist on states of separation barriers.
Indeed. I want to read to you this question from Marilyn. She writes about the gentleman whose family went back to their homeland, and he wanders about to their previous familiar places and finds himself staring at the flowers growing on the tracks under his feet while he is waiting for the train. And only slowly did I realize, says Marilyn, he is actually going to allow himself to die there. Not much drama, but deeply sad. I would say much of the emotion of these characters in many of these stories is one of deeply quiet desperation due to their alienation. I found myself unsettled after reading these stories unsettled and sad?
Thank you for sharing that from the reader.
Was that your intention to indicate how being apart, being alone, being lonely can lead one to that act of the ultimate in desperation?
Well, I suppose where my imagination took me in writing that story, that's where it went. And I suppose that character just didn't see a way out. And so decided to take his life, feeling that he had lost everything, and feeling very responsible for what had happened in the life of his family. But you asked me about intention. I don't write with any kind of intention in that way. I mean, some things, yes. I mean, I intentionally withheld the names. I intentionally don't say where the characters are, their countries of origin.
But did you intentionally know that he was going to take his own life?
Not until I got there, as I was writing. No,
really.
No, I had no idea.
You started with this man sort of trying to retrace his family of origin steps. But then, I mean, it was a surprise to me that after seeing those flowers on the tracks or under the tracks, did I realize he was going to stay there and wait for that train to take his life. How far were you into that story before you knew?
I think it was really the last scene. I think I got there. I mean, that story was written kind of in sequence. Many stories are written out of sequence, like the beginning comes at the end and you start out with the last scene, or you start out with a random scene and then build other scenes around it. But if I remember correctly, that story actually grew out of an incident in Rome. There was a terrible incident about a family that was basically, they had gotten an apartment through in public housing, shall we say, the equivalent of public housing, and there was such such hostility. It was a family, I don't remember where they were from, but they were not from Italy originally. And I remember seeing pictures of the family in the newspaper, and just the children, the small children, and the crowds of the residents sort of jeering at them, saying they didn't belong there, that they shouldn't have gotten this slot. And so the story grew partly out of that, and partly, I think, out of sort of more, shall we say, more open-ended questions about what is home, how precarious is home, the idea of home, how meaningful it is, and how destabilizing it is to lose one's home.
And to you, what do you consider home now?
I consider myself fortunate when I feel at home. So for me, home is really a feeling. And I mean, so technically, of course, I have I have a home in Brooklyn, and this home you see is it's not technically our home, but we have rented it for the past 12 years. And it's filled with our things. And so it also feels very much like home. And I feel at home here in this apartment. I feel at home in Rome. I feel at home when I go back to New York. But that said, I'm not tied to either place. What I really, friends and family, I need to see. And they're the thing I need live, when I'm in front of the sea or the ocean. I feel at home when I'm with people I love and care about. And that's how I think about it now as an adult. I mean, I was raised, as I've said, I was raised by people who had very concrete notions of what was home and what wasn't home, and that sense of that America was not our home, and that Kolkata was their real home. This created such anguish, and as attached as I am, to my places and my things, I try to also take a step back and realize, that it's important to not get too attached to these, to structures and to places. I think it's better to, I don't know, think of oneself, carry home on your,
Has living in Rome changed your perspective of America?
Yeah, in many ways it has. I mean, I think I was always raised with a double perspective to begin with. I never, we were always rooting for the other team in the Olympics, and there was just there were a lot of issues there in terms of like how I was raised and how we were supposed to align ourselves or not with American culture, American politics. For most of the time that I was growing up, my parents were not citizens. They didn't vote. That didn't mean they didn't follow American politics very keenly. But they didn't have the right to vote because they were not citizens at the time. I was not, I'm an American. Officially, I was not an American until I was 18. I was naturalized at the age of 18 because I was born in the UK. So I always had that outsider's view of America to begin with. I think, but Europe was new to me. I didn't know Europe until I moved here. I knew a little bit the UK, and I knew India. Those were the two other places I knew as a child, as an adolescent. So certainly being in Europe and seeing sort of what has been happening in Europe politically, culturally, socially, has broadened my perspective on many things. And sure, I mean, little things I'll notice when I go back to the United States. For example, in the United States, nobody ever calls me on the telephone. Whereas in Italy, they text me. They text me to see if they can call me. They say they'll send me a text saying, "Can I call you day after tomorrow at 5 p.m.? Is that a good time?" These are friends. These are not like business calls, whatever. These are friends who just want to chat with me or ask me how I'm doing, catch up. Whereas in Italy, my phone will ring, and I'll be walking down the street, my phone will ring, and I'll either say, "Hey, how are you?" or I'll say, "Sorry, I have a million groceries. Let me call you back in 10 minutes. That's something I noticed. That's certainly something I know whenever I go back to the United States in the fall. I realize something's not happening. Oh, yes, my phone isn't ringing.
And what about your children? Are they with you when you are in the United States and with you when you were in Rome?
They used to be, and then they grew up. And now they are, well,
On their own.
kind of, sort of. Our son just graduated from college, so he's on his own. He's in New York at the moment, but he was in Italy last month. And our daughter is in college, so she's also growing up quickly, and she's spending these hot days with a friend in the countryside right now outside of Rome. But she'll be back, and she'll head back to New York, in fact, a couple of weeks before we do. So we are in that phase of life where there's more autonomy, and it's a different set of variables now.
Going to be hard to let go.
It's very hard. Yeah.
I know the feeling well. My children are much older than yours, but I think about them a great deal and do not want to disturb them. They are all busy professionals, and I don't want to interrupt. So I wait for their calls, and they come on a fairly regular basis, but never enough
Never enough.
satisfy me. Jhumpa Lahiri, it's been such a great pleasure to talk with you again. 10 years is far too long for us not to have spoken. What are you working on now?
Well, first of all, thank you, Diane. It's been really a joy to speak with you, and I just love your questions, curiosity, editors. And well, now I have two projects. I've been co-translating Ovid's Metamorphoses from Latin into English with a colleague at Princeton, a classicist at Princeton named Yelena Baraz. And she and I have been working for the past 3 years on a new English translation of Ovid's great text. It will, I believe, be the first translation by two women. There are many translations, of course, already of the poem by various people, but I think this will be the first by two women. And Ovid's text is a foundational text for me, so it's a very meaningful project. It's a poem that, of course, celebrates transformation in all of its forms and speaks to me profoundly as a human being, and as a child of immigrants, as a person who's gone through, a series of changes, as we all do. So it's really a book that's taught me how to live. So I'm working on that, and I've also just recently started organizing some notes toward a new novel that
Wonderful.
yes, is just in its early phases.
I'll look forward to reading them both. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Take good care.
You too.
We'll hope to see you before long.
With pleasure. Thank you.
Thank
you so
you.
much.
Bye-bye.